The hatred towards Disney princesses started some time ago and has not gone down easily. This hatred, however, is much more towards the older princesses like Cinderella, Snow White, and Sleeping Beauty. Now, while a lot of that criticism is very much valid, there are still a few things that need to be put in consideration when criticizing a character like Snow White. Hence today's video. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. The very first video I made was a mild defense of Ariel, the Little Mermaid. Today's video is somewhat like that. Once again, I won't be explicitly focusing on the movie here, although references will of course peep in because the character of Snow White is very much a part of her movie. I will also not be using references from the previous lore as Snow White is very much a fairy tale and getting into that will require a whole other level of conversation. This video in that way will be a defense of Disney's Snow White and why I believe the character does not deserve all the hatred that we are giving her today. I hope you enjoy watching. Please like, subscribe and share if you do. I would love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Let's start with a brief summary of the film. The movie starts with setting up the context, explaining to the viewer why exactly is Snow White dressed up as a scullery maid. Snow White's stepmother, the queen, is incredibly vain, with her biggest worry being that one day Snow White will become fairer than her. Fairer here could refer to more beautiful, of course. This is why she's dressed in rags. One day, the magic mirror that the queen uses announces that Snow White is now the fairest in the land. In a fit of jealousy, the queen commands a huntsman to go and kill her, and to bring back her heart. For proof, you know. Unable to complete the task in front of her innocence, the huntsman asks the princess to run away and takes an animal's heart instead. Snow White, horrified at the idea and clearly going through something akin to my panic attacks, ends up coming across the cottage of the seven dwarfs. Mistakenly believing it is a house of orphan children, she decides to clean it up and cook for them in the hope that this would earn her points when she asks them to stay there.
I know. We'll clean the house and surprise them. Then maybe they'll let me stay.
After a very brief discussion, the dwarfs take a liking to her and promise to keep her safe. Snow White promises that she would ensure the house is clean and the food is cooked for them while she is there. However, this blissful time soon comes to an end as the queen figures out that Snow White is still alive. She disguises herself as a peddler woman in one of the scariest transformation scenes that I found as a kid, and still kind of do today, and then goes to the cottage to feed her the apple of sleeping death. Snow White initially resists, but the queen literally puts the apple in her hand. Given that she's just a child, Snow White takes a bite, and that is the end. The dwarves and Snow White's animal friends, having figured out what has happened, chase the queen to a cliff where she dies with a stroke of a lightning bolt. Funny how that works, huh? Given that she was able to literally manifest a thunderbolt at her wish. Anyway, with Snow White seemingly dead, the dwarves encase her in a glass coffin, unwilling to bury her. One day, a young prince, who had briefly appeared in the beginning of the film as her possible love interest, comes by the coffin in search of her and kisses her awake. This kiss breaks the spell as only love's first kiss could save her. Everyone is dancing and celebrating until Snow White and the prince ride off into the sunset. Now, the first of the two major criticisms towards her is that she's a very basic character with no development throughout the course of the movie. She is gullible, cheery, and naive when the story begins. She is gullible, cheery, and naive when the story ends. The other criticism is that she's a very poor role model in the sense that all she does is cook and clean for men and then goes away with the first man she comes across. Since the contemporary princesses do not rely on leading their lives according to the men in their lives, and since they do not sit and wait around for a big strong man to come and save them, they are considered to be much better. While I agree with the idea of fighting for one's own destiny and not letting it be decided by the other people in their lives, I do think there is some problem with this criticism. In order to understand that, however, we need to go a little deeper into its context. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs released in 1937. Now, there is no doubt that the movie has a huge importance from the historical standpoint, too much in Disney's personal history as well. But I won't talk about that today because, like I said, that will take away from the focus of the video. What I will focus on, however, is the time when it was released. The First World War was gone and the second one was just around the corner. There were wars, flus, and just too many horrifying things happening left and right. Not to forget the Great Depression in America. At that point in history, the world, or well, the country, I guess, because the movie wasn't as global back then, I believe, but I may be wrong in that regard, so please correct me, did not need a heroine who wanted to leave her home in search for a better life. They did not need one who wanted to be a part of another world. No, what was needed was to have a character that could endure all the wrong in the world and still smile through it in the hope for a happy ever after. When Snow White marries the prince in this movie, or at least gets swooped off her feet and is taken to his castle, she is proving to the many people watching it that yes, one of these days, things will get better. The end is near, and when it is, people can smile again. Good triumphed over evil in this movie because it had to. There was no other way that it could be accepted. It had to because for a world that had already turned upside down, it was important for the people to know that things can eventually improve for the good. This is why it is important for her story that Snow White does not change, that she remains the same person throughout because even after losing everything she holds dear and near and having to survive hell, she can still find her happily ever after. The second criticism towards her is the lack of agency she possesses. Her character isn't fleshed out and she is, more often than not, guided by the actions of the ones around her. The evil queen wants her dead, so she goes to stay with the dwarves. The dwarves need a servant, so she becomes that for them. But here's the other thing. Snow White does not clean their house or cook for them because they wanted her to. Snow White understood that she was a stranger to them. It was important for her to use the skills in her hand to ensure her survival. They had just as much right to throw her outside as they did in letting her stay. It is because she didn't believe in being a freeloader that she cooked and cleaned for them. It is because she took things in her own hand that she allowed herself to stay at their place. Sure, focusing too much on the beauty aspect, which the movie inevitably does, takes away from that depth. But there is still no doubt that this dialogue does in fact come in the movie.
We'll clean the house and surprise them. Then maybe they'll let me stay.
Now, of course, cleaning for the dwarves does eventually give her the typical housewife qualities, and those appear to be her only distinguishing features apart from her looks. Yes, but once again, the power of context comes into play here. We're talking about the 30s, when the society hadn't fully come to accept women for being able to do more. A good girl was someone who fit inside the gender norms. A good girl is still someone who does that, of course, but back then there was no other option. And here's the problem I have with this criticism. This criticism points to the fact that being able to cook and clean after yourself makes you a motherly figure. But do we not constantly criticize men who cannot do the same tasks? Why is it such a huge criticism when a female actually does them? Because these tasks have been traditionally linked with females? Sure, I get that logic. But then again, while these quote unquote feminine qualities are criticized in popular culture, the more quote unquote masculine qualities are much appreciated. Modern Disney princesses or even modern feminist icons on screen do lead a life like that. They are physical goddesses who can fight through every war and still survive. Sure, they get hurt in the way, but they are also strong enough to endure through the pain. And here's the thing, not every girl has to grow up to be a physical goddess like them. Not every girl can grow up to be that. Yes, you would want to hold enough strength to be as confident, or well, overconfident as Captain Marvel, and sure, you would want to fight the bad guys like Raya or anyone else because I honestly cannot think of a new name right now. But not everyone can do that. And when we can't, that makes us feel horrible about ourselves. In that way, then, this overemphasis on such traits, often associated with men, by the way, does not in fact bring the society forward. At least I don't think it does. What it does is put yet another restriction on what can be considered the good kind of role model, thus limiting those girls who cannot reach that space from feeling good about themselves. This is not progression, I think. This is sexism and patriarchy masked under the guise of progression. Just because one woman can endure that pain does not mean the entire human race can, and that's a fact. Now, here's the other thing that adds towards her lack of agency that people often fail to address. And yes, I do remember this is just a fairy tale when I'm speaking this out, but hear me on this one. Snow White comes from a very abusive situation. She's an orphan princess forced into servitude by her only remaining family figure, who also wants to kill her. In other words, Snow White is a victim of emotional and domestic abuse. Despite that, she craves to be as strong as she possibly could. A lot of people talk about how she could have simply given up and left. But could she really? Where would she go? Out on the streets? Yeah, right. She was lucky the dwarves helped her out when they did and that they were actually good people. Can you imagine what could have happened had they not been so good after all? But of course, once again, that's going in too deep, and the film doesn't exactly address any of that directly because it also has to stay true to two things: the story's fairy tale roots and its contemporary society. And of course, the movie was still an early film, so there was only so much they could do. Now, most of the Disney characters actually have a song that defines who they are and what they want in their lives, thus establishing what the context of the story will be like. This song is identified by its lyrics of longingness for something better or by their excessive usage of the word want. It is, because of this reason, also referred to as the I Want song. However, what Snow White has instead is an I Wish song.
I'm wishing for the one I love to find me today.
Here, she is wishing for someone to come and save her. It is true that in the modern context, waiting around for your love to swoop in and save the day is not an accepted idea. But once again, we're talking about the 30s here. This is the time when women were criticized for wanting more. Their only wants were supposed to be limited to the house. Heck, even today, so many women lead lives like that. Is it so wrong to want to find a prince who loves you and can save you then? Especially when one considers the abusive situation and the immense amount of hardship that she has just survived. Not to forget that she does not, in fact, spend the entire movie waiting for him. Yes, she mentions him twice, but that's about it. Nowhere does she indicate that she's waiting for him to come and rescue her. Sure, it would be nice to have him, but no one is out there searching for him. In other words, yes, Snow White's story is more about the circumstances that define her than her actions. Agreed upon that. She is, in that way, one of the weakest princesses in terms of her character, making it that much harder to defend her. However, at the same time, one cannot forget that this movie is still very much rooted in its fairy tale origins, or that when Snow White can, she tries to take an action. The idea about her cleaning for the dwarves is a case in point. This is why the criticism towards her, while it has a lot of thought, does not hold much ground. To add to that, and on a much different note, one cannot ignore the fact that it is because Snow White was the way she was, and it is because she was criticized for her actions that we have the princesses we have today. Who knows, 80 years down the line, we won't find Tiana to be feminist enough. You never know. This is the reason why it is important to remember that films like the one that Snow White's is are appreciated for the way they are because of how much meaning they bring to the current efforts. For its contemporaries, it was a masterpiece. For us, it can be a lot better. But it can only be a lot better today because society as a whole has evolved, making sure that the criticisms she faced may not be faced by the modern princesses. Not to forget, there is really nothing wrong in being optimistic and smiling through your life, is there? Especially given the recent context of the 2020 pandemic. Had it not been for the fact that we knew things would get better, who knows how many of us would have given up? I mean, so many of us did, right? But hey, that's it from me today. On a very grim note, of course. But still, thank you for watching today's video. I hope you like, subscribe, and share if you enjoy it. And if you would like me to make more such videos, then please leave your comments down below. Thank you for watching. Until next time, this is Ritika signing off for today.